And now we're going to get into the part that people can't seem to agree about. In this video, we're going to be looking at primary constructors. We're going to start by looking at the record type that was introduced and how record types have primary constructors, and then more recently in C#12, we got primary constructors on classes. So I'll be comparing and contrasting those and giving my opinion on where people can't seem to agree on the usage of primary constructors. A quick reminder to check the pinned comment for a link to my free weekly newsletter, and let's go jump right over to the code. Alright, here in Visual Studio, we're going to be looking at a record, a classic constructor for a class, as well as a primary constructor for a class. So we're going to start with the record type, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit more to pull it onto screen here, but here we can see a record declared with a primary constructor. And what this allows us to have is parameters that are passed in, so an integer that's an ID and a string that's a name, and these become properties that are effectively read-only. And this is a super nice shorthand because this is what you used to have to write. And now that I've added that whole thing on screen, you can see this used to be the way that we would have to declare things like data transfer objects or DTOs. Records are a great fit for a DTO, but look at how verbose this used to be. We used to have to write so much. Just to be able to have an ID field that's an integer and a name that's a string, we used to have to declare these arguments to be passed in. Then we would do an assignment right here in the constructor, but we would also have to declare these properties. So that would mean that for every type of property that you want to be able to add, you need to go touch 3 different spots. One here on line 50, we'd have to go add another line between line 53 and 54, and then add a new line after line 57. 3 different spots to be able to go add a property. And now all that we have to do is go add something onto the end of the record parameters that we're passing in to the primary constructor. So now that you can see what a primary constructor looks like on a record, let's look at some code that's using the record. You can see here on line 8, I'm instantiating a new instance of the record type, and I'm using a little bit more of a modern syntax here where we can have just the type on the left side, and then instead of having the type again, we can just use the word new. Another variation of doing this is being able to write record with var in front of it, and then doing new my record. So a lot of people aren't really a big fan of using var. Personally, I am, but now that we have this other type of syntax that we can write just like this and remove the type being duplicated a second time here on line 8, I find this is pretty clean. But what this line is doing is creating a new record. It's passing in 1 for the ID and then hello for the name. So seems pretty straightforward and pretty simple. What this does not allow you to do, though, is mutate those properties. So if you watch me uncomment these lines, Visual Studio will not allow you to assign new things onto those property values. And that's because with the primary constructor on a record, those effectively become read-only. They effectively only get instantiated by the primary constructor. But what we can do with those properties is read from them. They are read-only properties, so we can go run something like a console write line and read those values off with no problem. So that's what the record type primary constructor functionality looks like. It essentially gives us read-only properties that we only have to declare inside of the primary constructor, and essentially it removes these 2 other locations that we would have to go add information about the properties that we're trying to extend. And generally, we use records for something like a data transfer object, right? So not necessarily like a class or something that has a lot of logic in it. It's not performing algorithms, but it's something that's holding data that we transfer around inside of applications. So some type of state or result information that we can move between different parts of our application. So in my opinion, primary constructors on records are an awesome addition. Just having a record with primary constructors is great. When records were released, they came with this. So this is not net new, but this is what happened when we got records. And I'm going to go back to the code and we're going to start looking at classes, and I'll show you the classic version of a class. That's a lot of class. And then I'm going to show you the primary constructor version. So we'll see how that looks and then dive a little bit deeper. All right, now that we're back in the code here, we're going to look at the classic constructor class as the next example. So if I go expand this, this is going to look basically the exact same as the class that I wrote out by hand a little bit earlier for us when we were considering what my record would look like as a class. But instead of focusing on what's written right here, let's scroll up and see how we can use this class. The way that we would go instantiate this class is essentially the same way that we did the record. So all of the syntax is very much the same, and the fact that we have this code here not able to compile if we uncomment it, is the exact same as the record. And in fact, just like we saw with the record, we're able to read these property values off. So truly, declaring a class just like this is the same as having the record. And I wanted to show this code just to illustrate that the functionality is essentially the same between these two things. The record type is going to allow for some other stuff that we're not showing right here, but when it comes to these properties and being passed in either in the record as the primary constructor or with the class in this old school way that we were used to using by passing in the parameters and then assigning them to the properties that are explicitly written out like this, essentially the functionality is identical. So identical functionality for the usage of these properties, but when we have something like a record, it's just a lot simpler to go right. There's a lot less boilerplate code. It makes it easier to write, easier to read, just quicker. In my opinion, everything about it's better. And now we're going to get into the part that people can't seem to agree about. We're going to talk about primary constructors on classes, and this was introduced in C# 12, so this is pretty new depending on when you're watching this video. Now we're going to go over to Visual Studio and see how this works, but I wanted to call out why I think people have a bit of a challenge with this. And primary constructors on classes don't behave the exact same way that they do on records. And personally, I think that's people's biggest beef with it. Like, if you're going to introduce it, why not make it behave the same way? And I kind of get it, and I kind of don't. So I can understand why there's a bit of confusion and maybe a little bit of frustration around the usage. But let's go check out how they work. I'm going to show you the pattern the same way that we looked at the other ones, except with a primary constructor for a class. And then I'm going to show you a different way that I like to use primary constructors and why I think they work really well. All right, back in the code here, you can see that I have something waiting for us down here, so don't look, cover your eyes, but this part is the one we're going to look at with the primary constructor. And yet again, more surprises waiting for us. So this syntax might be shocking to some people if you haven't used it yet, because it's a little bit weird. But essentially, with a class now, this is not a record. With a class, we get a primary constructor, which if I scroll back up to the record, it looks very similar, right? We end up having this syntax right after the name of the type. So very cool. And I just wanted to show you that in a method, we can access the ID in the name. So in here, we do have access to these things being passed in. However, you'll notice, I'm going to go expand this classic constructor class now, that we didn't have to do this type of assignment, right? We didn't have to go declare the properties. We didn't have to do this assignment. If I collapse it again, you can see that we just get them. We just have access to them right in the constructor like this, which is nice because it's saving that boilerplate code. That's one of the advantages that we had with the record, and now we're able to get some of that on these primary constructors for classes. So I'm going to come back to this yikes comment in just a moment, but I want to scroll up and show you how this is used to compare it to the other examples. So we end up declaring and instantiating a primary constructor class just like we did the other types. So this part, the exact same. Now, when we go down to look at the properties, just like we were doing for the other examples that we looked at, if I uncomment this, it doesn't work as well. But the reason that it doesn't work is different. And that's because when we use a primary constructor on classes, we're not getting properties for name and ID. We're getting fields. So that behavior is different between records and classes. With the record, if I scroll back up here, we end up getting these two properties. These are things that exist, but we can't write to them. And that's why we're able to do this here, right? So that works on the record. They become read-only properties. But you'll notice that this next part that I wrote here, this also doesn't work with a primary constructor on a class. Not only are they not writable, but we can't read them. And that's because there's no actual properties created. So what does that mean? Well, if we scroll back down, we can see inside of the print method that we have ID and name. They're visible inside here. So they're just like having fields. But there's one more catch that makes these a little bit different than the records. And that is that these are not read-only. And that's where this yikes is going to come in, because what we're able to do is assign things after. So with primary constructors in the other cases, we got this ability to have initialize-only properties. And not only are these ones not properties, they're fields, they're also totally mutable. So at any point we can go do an assignment like this and it works. So these are two different behaviors that we get between records having primary constructors and classes having primary constructors. And like I said before I jumped into the code, I think that that's the big concern that people have. And I understand that, right? That's kind of frustrating. It's kind of weird. It's like, why do we have different behavior for these things that look very much the same? Even though a record and a class are slightly different, it just seems a little bit odd that the behavior that we would get out of the two things doesn't line up. But I don't let that bother me because I think the way that I would use primary constructors doesn't necessarily interfere here. I would not use primary constructors for things like I was showing you with the class. I'm not creating classes like that feel like DTOs, because I would just use a record for that. I am using primary constructors for other types of things where the concept of being able to mutate something just doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, it's not going to come up ever. On something like a DTO, especially if you're jamming a lot of stuff on it, you might find yourself in a situation where you can essentially mutate a property, and because you can, it might happen due to a bug or something else. But the way that I've set up my things, which I'll show you in just a moment, I don't really have to worry about that. So let's go check that out. All right, the way that I use primary constructors looks something a little bit like what you see on the screen right now. I've left out all of the implementation details of things like this because it doesn't really matter. But what you can see, kind of starting, if we think about layers in an application, I might have something like my business logic in a class, right? And it takes in a dependency that's my repository. So I want you to think about like a really simple layered architecture here where we have business logic and then a repository and then the actual connection that we use to be able to access that repository. So our business logic can take in this dependency, and you can see that I'm using an underscore naming pattern here because I treat these exactly like fields, right? I would do something like my repository and then suggest that it needs to do something here, and it would be just like a field. And it doesn't seem weird to me when I go to call this from the outside because I essentially am never calling constructors on things anymore. At least not like this. If I have logic in a class somewhere, I'm doing almost all of this through dependency injection. So this class would be registered to a dependency container, and I'm never typing the words new my business logic anywhere in the code base. So it doesn't feel weird for me to have a field defined like this. And also the likelihood of me writing something like my repository and setting it to null is basically zero. That would be kind of ridiculous for me to write, even though it's possible. But the other thing is that I'm never instantiating objects like this anyway. I don't do that kind of thing because it breaks a lot of my design approach for being able to unit test. So the fact that I only leverage things like this with dependency injection makes it such that primary constructors work pretty well. If I scroll up and we look at the my repository thing, it's the same idea with the connection factory. So yes, I could end up assigning connection factory to null in some code that I might write in here somewhere, but that never really comes up. I don't have a need to ever go set something to null, even though it's possible. And because instantiating things inside of a class, at least things that perform logic, goes against a lot of my testing principles, that means I'm not going to risk running into that either. So the downside of these things being mutable just doesn't really affect me personally. So to recap super quick, when I use primary constructors, it's essentially on records, so data transfer objects, and exclusive to that, or I'm using primary constructors now on classes that have logic. I don't really ever write classes now that are data transfer objects and use primary constructors. And it's for the reasons that I talked about. Having mutability sort of by accident or the fact that it can exist on a class when you use primary constructors seems to feel really weird to me if you're using it as a data transfer object. I feel like it's just a potential risk where something could go wrong. However, using primary constructors on these other types of services or components that I might be building out that perform logic, if I wire that all up with dependency injection, it just feels like it's working magically, and I'm getting rid of these big constructor blocks that essentially just repeat the field definitions anyway. So I'm removing basically half of the amount of fields that I would have to go declare and duplicate in the constructor. So I'm removing almost 2/3 of what I would have to write in terms of passing things in, because we would have the field declaration, we would have the parameter list in the constructor, and then we would have the assignment that happens inside the constructor. 2 of those go away. I almost put up the wrong finger there by accident, but 2 of those go away, and we're just left with passing them in through the constructor. It is the field definition at the same time. Now, what I would love to see is having something like a read-only keyword being put in front of that, and that way we could explicitly say to the compiler, I want this to be a read-only field when you go make it. I'm sure I'm not the first person to think about that, and I know the .NET team is filled with super smart people, so I'm sure there's a good reason why they can't do that yet, or they have not done it yet. But I'm hoping that they'll introduce something like that, because I think that that would just clean it up and give us the behavior that we would expect. But I'm curious to see what you think. Are you using primary constructors only with records, or are you starting to dabble with them in classes as well? Let me know in the comments. And that's it for this video, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.